In the midst of the US-Nigeria standoff over Trump's military threat, Nigeria managed to attract over $12 billion in bids for its Eurobond issuance. What does this say about how investors interpret sovereign risk in today's world? Good morning and welcome to another power-packed episode of Business Week. This week, Qatar Airways offloads its entire Cathay Pacific stake for nearly $900 million, while Senegal's Eurobonds plunge after IMF talks collapse. In South Sudan, the government appoints its 8th finance minister in just 5 years, and the Nigeria government re-enters the global debt market with a $2.35 billion Eurobond that stunned even the skeptics, drawing a record $13 billion in demand. Meanwhile, Tesla shareholders greenlight Elon Musk's monster $1 trillion pay package, and Standard Chartered CEO predicts nearly all global transactions will one day run on blockchain. And as inequality gains the spotlight, South Africa's president is pushing the G20 for a global panel to monitor wealth gaps. Later in our deep dive, we unpack the price of provocation, markets, minerals, and the Trump-Nigeria standoff as we look at the economic dimensions of Trump's military threat. If you missed any of these stories this week, don't stress, I've got you covered. I'm Rolake Akikogwe-Filani. As always, we start with a look at global energy commodities. Brent crude was down week on week by 2.11%. WTI was down as well by 1.47%. Now, this is really interesting because if you've been following the news recently, OPEC has held back on releasing as much production as it had earlier planned. There are now fears of a global supply glut and sluggish demand in some of the big consumer markets, energy consumer markets around the world. And of course, these are weighing down on demand. Of course, Middle East market pricing of Middle East conflict risk has also weighed in on trader sentiment here. Natural gas is up week on week by 7.11%, but RBOB gasoline is down by 2.02%. Let's take a look at equity markets, starting, of course, with Nigeria. It was really all red week on the stock exchange. I don't know if global events have anything to do with that, but certainly the all-share index was down by almost 3% week on week to close at 149,524.81 points. The number of deals also slumped, as did the volume of deals. Really sluggish demand there in terms of trading volumes on the NGX week on week. Although we did see some spikes during the course of the week, but value of deals was also down by almost 70%. And equity capitalization on the NGX closed the week down by almost 3% to end at 94.99 trillion naira. Let's take a look at equities markets in Africa. Not such a mixed picture across the Africa. Nairobi was up by 2.01%, but all the other key exchanges, Johannesburg, Accra, and Casablanca, did not follow suit. Let's look at Wall Street. Well, the big driver is here. The US government shutdown has now been going on for about 40 days, with the US losing quite a huge amount in terms of GDP in that country. Now, Dow Jones Industrial Index, S&P 500, and even the big tech stocks were all down. Which brings me to my top picks, because I'll be talking about the US in my top picks. But first of all, we start with the news that Qatar Airways has, after 7 years, offloaded its shares. It actually has offloaded about 9.78% equity stake that it had in Cathay Pacific. That's valued at about $900 million. And in fact, it sold its stake at about a 4% discount to the last closing share price of Cathay Pacific. But it was still a significant rise in the valuation of that stake compared to 2017, when Qatar Airways first made the bid for Cathay Pacific. It's a big divestment in the Airways investment strategy, but both airlines, of course, remain strong partners under the One World Alliance. Now, Cathay Pacific, the Hong Kong-owned airline, did suffer significantly after the COVID pandemic in 2020. Hong Kong, of course, being one of the last markets to reopen its borders for air traffic after that pandemic. But this is a good move because Cathay Pacific is actually buying back that stake, signaling continued confidence of the company in its own growth trajectory. Now we move on to Senegal. Senegal's Euro bonds maturing in 2048 and 2033 have slumped, with yields shooting up. I think the 2033 maturity saw yields rising to about 13.7% on the back of the price slump on that bond. Now, this is all related to the fact that last year the IMF suspended its $1.4 billion funding program in the country after the new government at the time discovered almost $11 billion in hidden debt, which was a hangover from the previous government. Now, the Senegalese government and the IMF have not been able to reach an agreement on how that is going to pan out. Investors got a bit jittery now, demanding higher yields to hold on to Senegalese government debt. So not a good one for the country, but hopefully this kind of market turbulence will actually force the government to reach some sort of agreement with the IMF soon enough. Now, South Sudan has replaced its finance minister for the 7th time in 5 years. Of course, this conflict has been going on since 2011. And one of the key consequences of it is that we've seen a major slump in revenue. Of course, the major oil pipeline has been offline now for several years. And we're now even seeing banks in South Sudan restricting cash withdrawals by consumers to about 50,000 Sudanese pounds a day. The country is facing serious headwinds. Now, there's speculation that the change in finance minister from someone who previously held the role was to ensure that the government could really shore up its position in negotiations vis-a-vis receiving external assistance from global creditors and whatnot. But surely this signals some level of turbulence within the administration and not really a good sign for investment in the country, certainly in the oil sector, which has borne the brunt of the slump. Now, China is projecting that by 2030, the country's GDP will be about 23.9 trillion naira. Let's put that in perspective. The US is the world's largest economy, has a GDP of about $30 trillion. And this is also part of a strategy to prepare for its next 5-year outlook. Of course, economic planning in China is done on a 5-yearly basis. So 2026, this is on the back of the announcement by Chinese Premier Li Kang during an export and trade summit in Shanghai that it plans to grow GDP annually over the next few years by about 4%. So how will we do this? Stimulating domestic demand, I guess, because the investment thesis for China has really slumped in recent years when you look at sectors like financial services and real estate, which has really been facing some serious headwinds. But the government now is saying actually the GDP projections for the future are pretty robust. And finally, the historic US shutdown, estimated to be costing the US up to $15 billion weekly in output. Now, this shutdown has been going on for almost 40 days now, the longest in history. The last one took place for about 35 days. Now, this is really over the failure of the Dems and the Republicans to reach an agreement over funding. And it also centers around the Affordable Care Act credits, which would have benefited around 20 million Americans, and neither the House nor the Senate were able to reach an agreement over that. Now, not good news for America, because we're now coming towards the holiday season, Thanksgiving at the end of November and the Christmas period. There is a real concern on what this will mean for jobs, what it will mean for investment in infrastructure, and of course, what this will mean for the long-term US government debt. That's it for my top picks from around the world. So now we'll take you to some of our other top stories from around the world. First, Tesla, it said its shareholders have voted in favor of Elon Musk's almost $1 trillion pay plan, with 75% support amongst voting shares. Now, the pay package from Musk consists of 12 tranches of shares that will be granted if Tesla hits certain milestones over the next decade. It would also give Musk increased voting power over the company, exceeding demands that he's made publicly since early 2024. His ownership would also increase from about 13 to 25%, adding more than 423 million shares to his holdings. Bill Winters, the CEO of Standard Chartered, foresees a future in which nearly all global transactions are conducted on a digital blockchain ledger. He told a crowd in Hong Kong last Monday as crypto adoption amongst mainstream banking and finance institutions grows. And he said, and I quote, "Our belief, which I think is shared by the leadership of Hong Kong, is that pretty much all transactions will settle on blockchains eventually and that all money will be digital," end of quote. The UK-based multinational bank CEO said this is likely to increase the speed and the value of global digital transactions. A G20 task force established by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has called for the creation of an international panel to tackle inequality, warning that extreme wealth disparities could disrupt democracy and cause economic instability. The task force said in a statement that a new panel on inequality should be modeled after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The panel would be responsible for monitoring the causes and impacts of inequality and providing insights to governments and policymakers. Nigeria has achieved a major milestone in its return to international capital markets, successfully raising $2.35 billion through a Eurobond issuance that drew an unprecedented $13 billion in investor orders. The Debt Management Office, in a statement, described the issuance as a landmark success that demonstrates global investor confidence in Nigeria's fiscal discipline and long-term growth trajectory. Despite geopolitical tensions and the recent U.S. military threat of action over the reports of Christian genocide in the country, investor enthusiasm remained remarkably strong, resulting in an oversubscription rate of 477%. The Katsina state government has proposed 156.3 billion naira for the education sector in its 2025 budget, the highest allocation amongst all sectors. The figure was announced by the Commissioner for Budget and Economic Planning, Alhaji Malik Anas, in Katsina on Wednesday, while giving a detailed breakdown of the budget proposal. According to Anas, education received the highest allocation in the 2026 proposal, representing 17.14% of the total budget.